David, we are experiencing a bizarre litany of technical issues this morning. I am loath to blame it on the deep state, Serco, etc. How are you, David?
I'm very well. I'm quite inspired because I think this is going to be, in spite of the impediment here, a very important show.
Yes. I think we've been on to some extremely important shows for the past several weeks, if not years. And people who are regularly viewing, sorry, David, everything failed. My air conditioner failed. Today is the first day I've needed to utilize the air conditioning here in New York. And that's a sign that summer is coming with the draconian regulations that have been brought into, I guess, law by decree by Governor Cuomo. There's a lot of tension building. But today, David, we're going to talk about something very important, a historical fact that a lot of people are unaware of. Why don't you tell us what we're going to be delving into today, David?
Well, thank you, Jason. So the background is that over the past 3 or 4 days, I've been ruminating on the career of President Bill Clinton and his roots, at least at the beginning of the career, in 1969, when he was expelled from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar under suspicion of rape. And he took off and went to Moscow, which I think is a very interesting career move, if that's the right term, for someone who, in a few years later, about 20 odd years later, would become the President of the United States. So I went back into what was going on in Oxford during World War II and subsequently, and revisited a very extraordinary operation called Operation Mincemeat. And then I started to ask myself, could Operation Mincemeat and Operation, let's call it Vigilant Guardian of 911 and Operation COVID-19, could they all have been masterminded by a cross group of Oxford University people, a double agent group, if you will, or a double cross group called XX, such that the BBC would have provide the cover fake news injection, while these double cross agents infiltrated society, and I'm talking in particular American, Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian and British society, to make the public believe that the attacks were coming from somewhere, when in fact they're effectively coming from inside those Five Eyes countries. And so going back to Bill Gates, as you know, I mean,
Bill Clinton.
Bill Gates, yes, although we come to Bill Clinton.
Gates or Clinton?
Bill Gates, I'm sorry. Bill Gates, yeah, Bill Clinton.
Right.
As you know, I keep going on with this phrase, reverse CSI, reverse crime scene investigation.
Right.
Because what I think is happening is when we get to listen to people investigating crimes like 911 or potentially COVID-19, we tend to assume that whatever we're told that happened preceding the COVID-19 pandemic is the truth. But then we have to go back to the situation in World War II, where the BBC played a major component as the world's leading news, entertainment, and propaganda facility in laying down a deceit or a deception that, in particular, the Germans believed in.
So now, let me pause you, David, because not everybody remembers what this Operation Mincemeat was. And I also want to remind people who are watching right now that every Friday, you and I are doing a sponsor-exclusive show that people can see on subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth and patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. We're having some technical problems with Patreon this morning, and if we're unable to resolve those, I'll keep checking it, and we might just continue the full show here on YouTube, but we do want to thank our generous sponsors that make this show possible each week. Operation Mincemeat, David, as I recall from you telling us on past shows, wasn't this where the British took a dead guy, loaded him up with allegedly secret documents in World War II and then floated him ashore to make it look like he had drowned and fallen off a boat or something like that? How did the BBC play a role there?
Well, because the Associated News was being broadcast through the BBC that would encourage the Germans to believe in this trap or this brilliant deception operation. So actually, it's a fascinating story because I've often thought, but never, and I think we're now very close to being able to prove it, that the role played by the man, a tramp, who had eaten rat poison, apparently committed suicide, and after a little investigation with the various pathologists, this individual was renamed, I think he was a captain or an acting major, Martin, right? He was dressed up in a uniform. His body was aged, and he was put in dry ice to preserve the body.
Wow.
Now, so then he floats ashore, and he's picked up by the Portuguese, I believe, who have some interaction with the German high command through an Abwehr agent. And of course, from the British point of view, what they're desperately anxious is, well, one of the things they're anxious is that there's no autopsy done on this body because it's been sitting in dry ice for a long while. And had a good pathologist done an autopsy, they would have found the kind of damage done when you got ice crystals, as I understand it, in the lungs. And of course, that's not a million miles away from what's going on with the people who should be doing the autopsy on this pandemic associated with COVID-19. But I digress. Let's stay with the story. So the man was loaded up with confidential letters between a couple of British generals, which indicated to the Germans, who eventually got to see or read the letters, that the invasion in the underbelly of Europe, as the soft underbelly, as Churchill would call it, would be through Greece and not Sicily. So I believe the Germans moved 3 divisions, I think that's 30,000 men, to Greece to be ready for what they thought would be a feint in Sicily, but in fact was the real thing. So it's considered to be one of the greatest deceptions in times of war. And what intrigues me is the role played by the various people associated with the Oxford Double Cross program that was created essentially by a Don, that's a faculty member at Oxford, called John C. Masterman, who wrote a book. And he wanted to get that published when I think he reached the age of 80, because that was the period post World War II when the Cambridge 5 spy ring had betrayed the United Kingdom. The reputation of the British intelligence services in the eyes of the Americans was about as low as you could possibly get, right? And Masterman felt that it was appropriate to restore some faith in the British intelligence amongst his American allies and friends. So he couldn't get permission.
Sorry, David, weren't there a lot of British intelligence officers who became authors like Ian Fleming? And I mean, we've explored in the past this concept of steganographic messaging within books. I mean, obviously, we're talking about when did this book get published by Masterman?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I know the British intelligence people refused to let him publish it up to about the 1970, 71 or 72 period. And eventually he decided that he'd go around British intelligence and contact his American friends, one of whom, I think it was a George Pearson, had worked with Masterman on the Double Cross program, and I believe in particular, the mincemeat operation. Now, this gentleman was on faculty at Yale University. So what intrigues me greatly, after Bill Clinton was expelled from Oxford, I believe in 1969, he goes to Moscow, and then he can't remember who he met in Moscow. That was in the first week of January of 1970. So what intrigues me is that he could remember lots of things about his past. It's a bit like Hillary Clinton. I don't remember after banging her head, with the Benghazi issue and that sort of thing. But then he comes back. This is Bill Clinton. He returns to the United States, right? Basically having either been debriefed or programmed or orientated by presumably Soviet intelligence. And he starts his career as on faculty at the University of Arkansas. Now, at the University of Arkansas, the physicians in the Medical Services Center in Arkansas had begun collecting blood from prisoners in the Arkansas correction system. So what intrigues me is, was there an opportunity to start developing? I mean, for example, let me back up here. Why would you collect prisoner blood that would be notoriously toxic because of all the infectious diseases shared amongst prisoners in the Arkansas prison system? Well, one reason to collect the blood would be if you want to develop a vaccine, you need a virus to develop it against.
Right.
So actually, Bill Clinton, by the time he became governor, I think it was in 1978, had an opportunity to develop that prison blood trade for the purposes of creating a pool of toxic blood, if you will, against which Big Pharma could develop vaccines. Now, Bill Clinton is probably directly or indirectly responsible for spreading Hep C and AIDS around the world, possibly infecting millions of people, and probably killing tens or hundreds of thousands of people, which is quite a pedigree to go into an election campaign, ultimately, for president. And that, of course, was in the 1992 election. So I'm just going to race through Bill Clinton's career, because why I think that he might have become a double-cross agent working with the Oxford group, Oxford University group, is in 1992, he has his presidential election campaign headquarters at the Intercontinental Barclay Hotel in New York. Now that's interesting, because in 1991, Ghislaine Maxwell, right, who would appear to be, and no one seems to want to debate me on that, a pedophile pimp and blackmail victim handler. She arrives in New York in 1991, and she has a huge, what's the proper word? A trust, an annual payment of about $100,000 made in 1991 through a trust essentially set up by her late father's operation at the Mirror Group. Now, her late father, Robert Maxwell, had stolen $400 million worth, I think, of funds from the Mirror Group pension. And she actually delivered a packet full of money, unknowingly, allegedly, to someone in New York. But essentially, she set up a very sophisticated social network between Jeffrey Epstein and some of the wealthy people or ambitious people working with Epstein in what ultimately became a global pedophile racket, where wealthy people, including Bill Clinton, could hop on the Lolita Express, as it's called, possibly entertained by Ghislaine Maxwell, and go to this island and be serviced by various young girls. So it would appear that I think that Bill Clinton would be a very attractive target for a double cross operation, because essentially the British, the Oxford University double cross group, and the BBC could place a double agent right within the heart of the American establishment, all the way up to becoming president for 2 terms in the 1990s.
Well, David, I would even argue that this technique was conceived of and deliberately executed, this notion of finding a vulnerable, you'd need a target that meets a lot of requirements. He'd have to be very charismatic. You'd probably want a nonviolent psychopath, someone who is charismatic but doesn't have empathy and is willing to do things that would involve cruelty and disregarding the law. I mean, you've spoken about Bill Clinton's, the allegations against him that he was dealing drugs in Oxford. I mean, this is an insane thing to do, particularly in a foreign country when you're not a citizen of that country. I mean, you're basically guaranteed to get in a huge amount of trouble, deported, thrown in jail, whatever. But yet Clinton seems to be doing all these things. in my view, it seems like they found him, got him at an age where he's old enough to determine that this is somebody who's smart, this is somebody who could go somewhere, but he's also a psychopath. So let's entrap him in something that we could use against him for the rest of his career, kind of like Barack Obama. Somebody
Yes.
who has leanings towards Marxism, towards communism. Can you explain to people a bit more, David, about what this double-cross system is?
Well, apparently, Masterman and his colleagues in British intelligence realized that it was okay if you could identify a spy, let's say the Germans, that is sent into the UK to spy, and maybe torture him or shoot him. But actually, you get, or her for that matter, but you actually get much more value out of a spy that you can turn around, turn them into a double agent, right? So that the Germans continue to believe that this spy is providing them with good information, but the British then feed this individual with fake information, right? So that the Germans start making decisions to, for example, well, follow up that lead where it would appear that the invasion in the soft underbelly of Europe is going to be through Greece and not Sicily. So they move 3 divisions. So these kind of spies are much more valuable alive and turned than dead, right? That go back into the cave, and then the Germans start to recognize that their agents are being rolled up and killed or disappearing, as opposed to feeding them enough accurate information for the Germans to be persuaded or deceived into following a path that minimizes British or Allied casualties in Europe.
And David,
And of
may I
course,
add, this double-cross system, the utilization of double agents, operational plants, they're sometimes referred to as, this remains a very popular technique. We know that as recently as maybe it was the 1990s, this guy Robert Hansen was found to be a mole within the FBI, very highly placed FBI. I think he was the deputy director even at one point. Mike Moore has spoken about how he was involved in some private contracting for the FBI at the time that this was discovered. Kevin Shipp has also told us that he was part of a team that routed out this mole within the FBI. Robert Hansen was one of the most dangerous counterintelligence operatives and has done kind of the most damage of any of these double agents. I would also add, David, that this use of operational plants and double agents, it falls right into this concept you've told us about many, many times, the friend or foe switching. If someone is an agent, obviously they're a friend, but if they're a double agent, they've switched to foe, haven't they?
oh yeah, and that could be instant and then back again, right? So again, it comes back to what role might the BBC have played in running these double agents into countries where at first blush you'd think that would be allied to the BBC and the British, including the United States. But of course, if you look behind the agenda, all right, for example, we go back to Rockefeller's quote, I think from 1993. He said, "The world is ready to move to a supranational government of international bankers and an intellectual elite." That goes back to the 1984 dystopian novel by George Orwell and Room 101. And the inner party in 1984 is the first, and of course it's fictional, except I believe it's real today. It's a non-ideological party. It merely seeks to maintain power over the outer party and the proletariat. And what you're seeing now, I think, with this games that we're playing with China and Canada and the Five Eyes countries, the movement towards the COVID-19 or the post-COVID-19 world, it's a non-ideological world where we're all supposed to be wearing masks, maintaining social distances, and any suggestion that you're right wing or left wing is actually ignored. So you go around, as I understand it, in New York, and you feel there's a level of hostility that is breaking out merely if you're walking on the sidewalk without a mask, right?
Yeah.
There are people there who now believe you're betraying the society, etc. This is the ultimate dream of the non-ideological inner party of the BBC, right? So now let's going forward with this concept of what you've got is now a supranational government of international bankers and an intellectual elite, and look at the development and the role played by Bill Clinton. Sorry, I keep making that
Sorry,
mistake.
David, before we move off of that, there's something that I really wanted to show you that I photographed on the street just the other day. This is straight out of the INGSOC 1984. This is a real sign that I saw on a construction site. This is a safe job site. Wear a mask. Look at that.
Oh,
INGSOC.
totally. Yes, INGSOC. And the double agent concept refined and developed at Oxford University and incorporated into the BBC's communication network, which, as I pointed out, we've covered over multiple shows, basically incorporates a group of patented devices, in particular, the one that relates to the spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals. And that was patented, or at least the patent applied for, in 1998, in August the 3rd, 1998, 4 days before my birthday, and 4 days before the attack on the American embassies in East Africa, in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. And I'm starting to think, well, actually, I think I persuaded myself now, all of these bizarre kind of attacks that are very sophisticated and synchronized, and they are associated with the injection of fake news by the BBC, the simultaneous, or actually the fake news is generated by the BBC before the event occurs, as it occurred on 9/11 with Jane Stanley in New York, where she's broadcasting through the BBC, through, I believe, this device, and she reads from the script or the prompt, we're getting news that the Salomon Brothers building has collapsed, but it's still standing behind her left shoulder. So the television signals that I believe you could think of them as digital blocking notes that should have gone to the demolition crew arrived late, or maybe they had trouble putting the fuses into the building, because building number 7, which is the Salomon Brothers building, came down about 17 minutes after Jane Stanley had got news that it had collapsed. So again, you've got this extraordinary example of the simultaneous creation of a fake news channel, and the only one that matters is the BBC.
There's another thing that comes to mind when you tell us about this, David. I'm thinking of the Bill Ayers New York Times September 11th article, because it's one of these things that seems so almost uncanny, I guess would be the word, in terms of its near prediction of the event. This was an article that was published in the New York Times in the early edition on September 11th, 2001. People can still see it with the New York Times time machine. No regret for a love of explosives. And this is talking about Bill Ayers' memoir. He doesn't regret setting off bombs. In fact, he feels they didn't do enough. And you've told me the targets of the Weather Underground were banks, airplanes, universities. How do we know, David, that these guys didn't set out in the 1960s to overthrow the government and finally succeed in 2016?
Well, I would argue that these people are classic examples, potentially, of double agents for the Oxford Group, right? And the BBC, the world's largest broadcaster of propaganda, news, and entertainment.
Can I introduce another character, David, that you haven't spoken about, but I think plays into this? There was some interaction between the Weather Underground and the Black Panther Party, right? They were all doing a lot of stuff in Chicago. I didn't know this until very recently, but Bobby Rush is a Democratic representative for Illinois' 1st District and has been since 1993, when Bill Clinton came in as president. Bobby Rush was the founder of the Black Panther Party in Illinois.
Well, again, this is, and I believe the three-fingered fork salute, which the Black Panthers give to each other, was invented by Bernardine Dawn after the stabbing in the belly of Sharon Tate, right? by the Charlie Manson group. So there is a level of underlying cruelty and brutality consistent with that theory of getting someone to turn, developed and I believe touched on in the George Orwell book of Room 101.
There's
Because
one
a lot
more
of
thing
very
I'd like
strong...
to share with you about Bobby Rush, David. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
He's introduced this bill, House Resolution 6666. It's the COVID-19 Testing, Reaching, and Contacting Everyone Act, the TRACE Act. And this is basically, if you read it, it's not entirely dissimilar from the Black Panther Party's manifesto of destroying the economy and locking everybody up, creating civil unrest. We've seen police officers in Sydney, Australia, and the city I'm in right now rip their children from them, from women. Police officers have been arresting women for not socially distancing and wearing the COVID-19 mask, putting them in jail where they've been releasing already convicted criminals for fear that they might get COVID-19. Now, wait a minute. Did you just freeze there, David? Have I lost you?
No,
you're still
I'm
with
here.
us. Okay. So basically, they're throwing mothers in jail and essentially traumatizing their children by physically, accosting the mothers to put them in jail where they might catch COVID-19, where they're releasing dangerous criminals for fear they might catch COVID-19. Does that make any sense to you, David?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything is dropping into place once we understand.
But how does it make sense?
Well, because there is a connection, right, from woe to go, just using Bill Clinton's career, right? And for example, his career ultimately to the President of the United States, where in 1997, he sends John Shalikashvili to China. And John Shalikashvili, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, gives a presentation to the PLA generals at the military university in Beijing. And in a transcript that has been deleted, or I can't find it anymore, but I know it existed, in the transcript of the speech that Shalikashvili gave to the PLA generals, he said, "My president," that's Bill Clinton, this is 1997, has instructed me to deliver details of all America's weapons programs to you guys in the interest of world peace. Well, Bill Clinton and John Shalikashvili, in my opinion, I won't go what I think should have happened to them, but I believe, be legitimately annoyed as a citizen of the United States, if I was, to say, well, what the hell did these guys give to the communist Chinese? What about details of a double cross program where you develop or supply some pharmaceutical companies or industries or research labs with tainted blood from the prison system run effectively by the cronies of Bill Clinton, and see if they can identify a virus from that prison blood that requires a vaccine to control the number of fatalities as that virus is spread through the community. And then instead of actually shipping files of tainted blood, which is what the Clinton administration did, you actually have an infected prisoner who might be an asymptomatic carrier to visit Wuhan City, right? And spread the virus knowing that there is a vaccine under development. And so I've been astonished recently to find that there is a vaccine under development by an outfit called CanSino Biologics, right? Which got a listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, courtesy of the law firm representing them, which is Sidley Austin of Chicago.
Well, that's really important too. We've spoken about Sidley Austin quite a bit. And one of the things that you've helped me to understand is that it seems in modern presidencies, there is a need for a law firm to assist the president in a variety of ways. And there's ways that someone holding the office of president can empower a law firm in a variety of ways. Making partners at the law firm into attorneys general seems to be one of those ways we see, obviously Bill and Hillary Clinton are closely associated with the Rose Law Firm, Barack Obama has been closely associated with the Sidley Austin law firm, but he also has empowered Covington and Burling by making Eric Holder his attorney general. Covington and Burling is now right in the middle of this huge controversy surrounding General Flynn. I don't know if you've heard about this there in Canada, David, but the federal judge, Emmett Sullivan, has just invited the fired lawyers of Covington and Burling to actually speak at this upcoming amicus curiae presentation where a former judge, this is an unprecedented situation, by the way, the Department of Justice has decided to drop the charges against General Flynn because new information has come to light that indicates the FBI did things that might even be illegal to entrap Flynn. And what Judge Emmett Sullivan is doing now is basically saying, not so fast. I intend to make sure that General Flynn doesn't get away so easily, and he's doing some really unheard of things. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got this nexus of powerful law firms. In the case of Sidley Austin, it was established in 1866. And one of its first clients was Mary Talbot Lincoln. And subsequent clients were included, I think, is it Elizabeth McCormick Rockefeller and her estate from John D. Rockefeller. And then, I want to stay with the infected blood concept and the bacteria and the use of bacteria or viruses as a method of intimidating and extorting concessions from wealthy families under the control or influence or direction of a law firm such as Sidley Austin. So just going back past the Clinton dirty blood or tainted blood racket of the 1970s right through to the 1990s and quite possibly to the present time, and going back to the early part of the last century, we have the extraordinary story of an Irish immigrant nicknamed, I think her name was Mary Mahon, and she was nicknamed Typhoid Mary. And she worked for, I believe, 7 wealthy families in the New York area in 2 stages separated by a period of quarantine. That is to say, about 4 families were infected by this woman who was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid bacteria. And I believe I forget the name of I think it's an outfit called the Charles Herbert or Henry Warren, I think it is, was a wealthy family whose members got sick after they'd been served food prepared by Typhoid Mary. And I believe Charles Warren hired an investigator to see if he could find out why that family, which was wealthy, and typhoid was generally restricted to the poorer areas of New York, as I understand, why were they getting infected? Eventually, it was identified with this Mary Mahon, and she was put into quarantine temporarily, I think for 2 or 3 years. She was released on 1912 or 13 or 14. Yeah, for a period of quarantine. And she was released on the understanding she would not go back as a cook to wealthy families. And so she set up as a laundress, a laundry woman. But she didn't make a go of it. And after 2 years, she changed her name. And she began cooking for wealthy families again, and another group of families. Members sick or members died. And I believe she was a super spreader before the term even existed.
But this David, was the run-up. What if they wanted us to believe that? What if something else caused those people to be sick and they deliberately wanted people to think Typhoid Mary was the cause of it for some reason?
Well, that's a legitimate question. Another question might be, maybe there were powerful forces that led to her being released after quarantine that had discovered this was an extraordinary method of extorting money or concessions from wealthy families. Let's say the Rockefeller family.
Because it seems like there's been a long history of wanting to use germ warfare because it would inherently give the attacker the plausible deniability of saying, oh, well, this person just got sick. We didn't attack them. They tried to do it with Castro, according to Judith Very Baker. They tried to weaponize cancer, and they wanted to inject Castro with cancer. Everything you're talking about with the Arkansas blood scandal, well, one reason why you why you might want a lot of blood from prisoners is that you'd have access to a lot of different viruses that you could research and try to weaponize.
Yes, because of the behavior of the prisoners, and that's another extraordinary story with that Arkansas correction scam set up by Bill Clinton. The prisoners were giving blood at $7 a pint, and they were getting paid in scrip, which I understand is like prison money with which you can go to the cafeteria and buy some cigarettes or something like that, or even sexual favors.
But I have to add something to this hypothesis, David, because I don't think that the Clintons would be satisfied with just a 7x profit, this concept of buying the blood for $7 and selling it for $50. Doesn't seem like enough of a motive for them. That seems like a side operation where they're trying to get access to these viruses, and to fund that operation will sell the blood for 7 times what we pay for it. But then when we get these viruses, we'll use them to study biological warfare and try to weaponize these viruses.
You've nailed it. You've nailed it. So I think Bill Clinton was used by the Oxford Double Cross Club, right, to build up a weaponized approach to germ warfare, right, such that you could then focus your germs or your viruses at given geostrategic targets, right, and bring them to their knees. And I don't know if you're able to, you certainly did it last year. You remember that BBC, it has a daily presentation called The Spread of the Virus. And there's a series of graphics and charts that I find very interesting. In particular, down below, there is a chart that shows the initial, from day one, spread of the virus in Wuhan City. And then over the period of time, other countries get dialed in with this spread of the virus. Yeah, so if you scroll down on that, tracking the global, maybe you can just keep going, and then you'll see a bar chart. Keep going. More. Right, stop there. That's it. Now, this to me, I mean, you hear about lies, damned lies, and statistics, but let's ask your listeners or the watchers of this just to watch that as it goes through the cycle, and then see if they can understand what I think is happening here. And of course, it starts with the initial attack, let's say, on Wuhan City. But what's very interesting is where it ends up at the end of the period to the present day. There we are. There's the Wuhan City breakout, right? And along the bottom axis is the time. And you'll see it's got the Johns Hopkins University in the bottom left and the BBC on the right, which means to me the BBC is deeply involved in the generation of fake news associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, because there is a political agenda here. Right?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Now, watch what happens, right?
What are we looking at?
You end up, well, what you end up now, or you will end up now, with the United States, right, being the worst offender, at least statistically, and all the other countries, and China's dropped off the map.
Yeah, interesting.
So now, from a geostrategic point of view, it makes it look like China, the Communist Party, the oligarchy, probably one of the most corrupt regimes on the planet, has done a wonderful job controlling this virus. And the Americans, because of the arrogance of, let's say, Donald Trump, have screwed up completely because they reacted late, but they reacted late because Donald Trump was being told this is not serious by the experts in between him and the real world. So they basically, I believe, set up Donald Trump to fail. And what they're desperately anxious is that Donald Trump does not get a second term.
Right. I agree with that.
Now,
it's interesting to see how these shuffle around.
Look at the statistics. But again, what is very telling, this is a joint presentation by the BBC and the Johns Hopkins University, which co-hosted the Event 201 in the Pierre Hotel in New York on the 19th of October last year with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which simulated 65 million dead, right? So to say that this is a surprise, it's not a surprise. This is an engineered virus where they're using asymptomatic carriers, I believe, to actually take the virus into target areas like New York and create the impression that the administration or the government of New York State or the federal government of the United States is failing because they're incompetent. Now, here we've got a huge problem, because I believe that we'll be able to demonstrate that the development of the virus for COVID-19 was contemporary with the development of the vaccine. I believe it's extremely likely that they have a vaccine all ready to go, right? And the company that will be the first and the country that will be first to put that on the market will be Canada and CanSino Biologics, which is licensed or registered or been set up in Hong Kong with the Chinese Army Medical Services Center. So what's going to happen is Justin Trudeau, and his roots, of course, go back, I believe, to the extraordinarily corrupt Pierre Trudeau, his father, who there was no dictator in the world that Pierre Trudeau didn't love. So in 1973, I believe Pierre Trudeau was a double agent in 1973.
He was a Fabian socialist, wasn't he?
Yes, right.
And he went to Oxford, didn't he?
No, he went to the London School of Economics.
Ah,
which is the
even
home
better.
of the
That's where the Fabians hang out, is the London School of Economics.
That's right. So in 1973, Pierre Trudeau is in China talking to Mao Zedong, probably the greatest killer the world has ever known. Not directly, of course, but none of these socialists kill directly, or at least one or two who are psychopaths. But the higher grade of socialists is up to their arms in blood. You know, the National Socialist Party, that's a long term for the Nazis under Adolf Hitler. And the socialists or communists under Mao Zedong, directly or indirectly responsible, some people talk about 80 million dead. So you've got Pierre Trudeau, right, who's shaking hands with Mao Zedong, who's a psychopath, a genocidal
He's delighted
psychopath.
to meet him. You look at him. He looks super happy.
And I believe in 1973, Pierre Trudeau began accelerating the transfer of Five Eyes technology, including weapons technology, to the communist Chinese. Pierre Trudeau visited Castro in Cuba, and there are many people who think that Fidel Castro is the father of Justin Trudeau. Do I want to go there? Well, not particularly. It's a waste of time. But I do know that the Sidley Austin gang associated with Bernardine Dawn visited Castro, I think in 1972 or something like that. So you've got a network of socialists that I believe the real aim is a supranational government of international bankers and an intellectual elite, where for them, the intellectual elite resides in the university system.
How do we know that Bernardine Dawn was hanging out with Castro?
They don't say he was hanging out, but she took her friends and they went to Cuba and did a tour, and they were entertained and royally treated, as I understand it, by Fidel Castro.
Wow.
And that's in the early 1970s. And you'll find pictures of Pierre Trudeau with Castro, with the adoring eyes of his wife, all right, and holding Justin Trudeau, the baby. So you've got a nice little group. When Pierre Trudeau passes away, the memorial service, no world leader other than Castro came to that memorial service. Ronald Reagan didn't want to go there, right? Maggie Thatcher didn't want to go there.
For Pierre Trudeau?
Yeah, for Pierre Trudeau, because
Really?
they know Pierre Trudeau had sold the Five Eyes countries down the river.
Wow, I didn't know that. So this is Justin as a baby. Here's Castro, and here's the mom.
And you could do a little of your wonderful morphing, I'm sure. You'll find pictures of Justin Trudeau beside Yeah, there you are.
This is the
Beside Castro.
most surprising right here, because this shows Castro at approximately the same age as Justin Trudeau. And I mean, David, they look remarkably similar to me. That seems odd.
Well, it's not odd if he's the father.
Right. That's what I mean.
Right. Right. So
But
what
wait a
I
minute.
think is,
Before we move off of Weather Underground visiting Castro, what in 1970? So Bill Clinton would have been, already have visited the USSR. What's the connection between Bernardine Dorn, the Weather Underground, Bill Clinton? Is there a direct connection?
well, so Bill Clinton comes back from Moscow in 1970-71 period. And incidentally, when he's quizzed during these election campaigns about his trip to Moscow, he says he doesn't remember who he met.
Come
Well, he
on
spent
now.
a week in Moscow. Apparently, he says, I was a student in England, right, at that time. But I don't think he was, because he'd been expelled by Oxford University after the rape of this woman, Wellstone, or the alleged rape. So he's lying. And he's concealing, it would appear, a record, and he would go on to be accused of, there are multiple cases of his alleged rape, including a 14-year-old girl who
Ooh.
passed out after a party with cocaine.
Whoa.
And let me just see if I can see that. And right, so I'm looking at, why should men and women die in a war for a serial rapist? There are 6 credible known rape allegations against Bill Clinton. 1969, Eileen Wellstone at Oxford. 1972, a woman at Yale University, and that's important. 1978, Juanita Broderick.
Who
1978,
I've personally spoken to,
oh, interesting.
and she's very credible.
1978, forced fellatio on an Arkansas woman lawyer. 1983, Miss America Elizabeth Ward Grayson. And 1984, a 14-year-old girl who had passed out on cocaine at a party.
Where are you
So when
getting
you,
that from, David? Where is that
well,
article?
the heading of that particular article is, "Why should men and women die in a war for a serial rapist?" So I've actually hot linked that, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it. Now, I can't double check all of these. I just believe this is an undisputed litany of allegations, each one of which would perhaps require a lifetime to prove. But they want you or us or American citizens to spend a great deal of time proving something that is unprovable, because they've removed the evidence of the crime, right? So we've got a couple of very interesting events associated with the torture and killing of people, including, for example, the Starnet raid in Vancouver of 1999 in August, when the sergeant responsible for southwestern crime scene investigations would become the commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and his name is Bob Paulson. As we
Right.
know, all of that evidence was removed from Starnet Communications, where Starnet Communications were as alleged to have engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming in 60 countries. So all of that kit, so when they ask us to prove something, you can't prove something if all of the kit that is underlying the fraud or the crime has been removed and disappeared, right? So they set an impossible goal for the citizen that wants to prove something. Now, interestingly, Bob Paulson is the man who fast-tracked Cameron Ortis as the director of intelligence of the RCMP during the operation, the 10-year operation of Phantom Secure, which is a modified BlackBerry. And it would be really interesting to know what the chips were inserted in that modified BlackBerry. And I think you've got some points on that. But that was involved in a criminal operation servicing 20,000 criminals around the world engaged in drug trafficking, apparently, money laundering, and murder for hire. So this guy is dragged off to the chokey released on bail and then put back in the prison.
What's the chokey? Jail?
Choke is a prison. It's slang for a prison in a Brit word, right?
Okay.
And when they go to his home, they find 30 computers apparently programmed, a bit like the phantom secure technology, to self-destruct or remove or delete their databases if they're opened without the correct passwords. Anyway, it's made extremely difficult. But I'm saying, where is Cameron Ortis today?
Where is he?
Would he not be well, he's in jail, right? But he hasn't, as far as I know, been brought to trial, right? But wouldn't he know if there was a business of tainted blood being shipped around the world on Conair planes, right, carrying an individual who's got a particularly interesting set of viruses in his bloodstream, who could go to Wuhan City and be used perhaps as in a research laboratory to develop the vaccines against that particular variety of virus that he's got in his bloodstream. So now you've got the Canadian justice system, in my opinion, totally compromised by organized crime, because the really interesting serial killings and murders, they don't go solved. So when, for example, the founders of Starnet Communications, the founders of Phantom Secure are locked up, and there's 3 of them, what happened to the 20,000 criminals that they were servicing? They're still out there. And I would argue, Jason, many of them are behind bars, because that's a great place and gives you, 3 square meals a day and a nice, lifestyle, particularly if you're compatible with your cellmates, right? Where you're secure with an alibi, while a criminal organization infiltrates every significant arm of the Five Eyes countries, including the FBI, the RCMP, and the National Crime Squad in the United Kingdom. Over to you.
David, hadn't we heard that Jeffrey Epstein's cellmate at the MCC, the correctional facility here in Manhattan, had a mobile phone?
Yes, you did.
Do we know if it was a Phantom Secure mobile phone?
No, we don't know if Hillary Clinton's phone was a Phantom Secure one.
We do know that having a mobile phone in prison is considered contraband. So how did this guy get it?
Because the prison system in the United States has been corrupted by people who use a variety of techniques, including, I allege, pedophile or sexual entrapment and blackmail, of which there are a number of very practiced practitioners, if you will, including Ghislaine Maxwell, right? Remember, Bill Clinton made 26 trips on the Lolita Express to that island, and Hillary Clinton made 6. And I've seen pictures, I think you have as well, where the chalet, the bathroom in the chalet, one of Epstein's buildings on that island, has got a dental chair. Now,
No, that's not on the island. That was at his house in Miami or Palm Beach or whatever. David, isn't this interesting that in the cell, the guy had a phone that gives new meaning to the word cell phone? But
well, that's right. And he's a muscle-bound guy, and he's perfectly capable, apparently, of snapping the hyoid bone of Jeffrey Epstein, which implies far more strangulation than suicide, death by hanging.
It doesn't tell us too much about the phone. Prosecutors said the prison staff believed the mini phone was only capable of making voice calls. What are they talking about? Not sending or receiving written messages. So there is a lot of, it says, if he used the phone regardless of whether it was his or not and texted with his wife or any member of his legal team, then that would be privileged. That what? So the guy has an illegal phone. He's a prisoner in jail, and they're saying that they can't subpoena the phone because the communications were privileged?
Yeah.
That's crazy. David, it sounds a lot to me like the evidence shenanigans that the FBI played when Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers were guilty as hell, but free as a bird. We know that there are criminals. Look, there are unsophisticated criminals who just straight out go and do crimes. Then there are sophisticated criminals who understand the law and can dance between the raindrops of getting prosecuted. That's kind of a spectrum, and we're dealing with Bill Clinton, Bernadine Dorn, she's got expertise in law. It's very interesting to look at these people who have expertise in law and break the law. They should be scrutinized very closely, don't you think?
Oh, well, totally. And when you talk about sophisticated and unsophisticated criminals, in the 1950s and the 1960s, organized crime in London was controlled through the Cray twins and their mentor, a guy called Umberto Rossi, who died, I think, at 95 years old. And they called him Battles Rossi. And he had interactions with the mob in the United States. But the Cray twins were into blackmail and protection rackets involving producing pornography with children and blackmailing the abusers, like it would appear Lord Boothby in the United Kingdom, who was one of the founder members of the Bilderberg meeting, I think in 1954. So the Cray twins, from behind bars, ran a protection racket. And what I'm alleging is that model, running a protection racket from behind bars, was exported through this double-cross program promoted by the Oxford group and the BBC into the United States, so that you now have, I would allege, a whole bunch of sophisticated criminals within the prison system, which has been partly privatized, right, such that they can operate hardcore pornography racket, money laundering, and drug trafficking from behind bars with a nearly perfect alibi. So coming back to the original theme here, that I believe that Bill Clinton was a double agent, or double cross agent, operated by the Oxford group and the BBC. You've got Bill Clinton. He goes through this period at Oxford. He's expelled for rape. He goes to Moscow. He comes back and he takes a law degree at Yale University. During the period when John C. Masterman, the author of that book on the double cross, was negotiating outside the United Kingdom with a Yale professor called Pearson. And eventually, Masterman was able to get his book published, which lays down the double cross techniques as used by the British in World War II.
Was it published by Yale?
Published by Yale University Press, I think it is.
Wow. What is the connection between Oxford and Yale?
Well, obviously, there've been people, they're both old established. Yale, I think, is colonial, founded in the colonial era, isn't it? When was it founded? Pre-1776?
I don't know.
Same sort of vintage, I think, as Harvard. And, I've got that hat from Cambridge University that's got established 1208, which is a source of some pride, that goes back so many years. But what I'm saying is the Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge cartel, if that's the right word, of intellectual elites, had they been penetrated or infiltrated by people like Bernadine Dorn, who was a lecturer at Northwestern University, who had a seminar on torture paradigms and practice, you could take the academic community, the intellectual elite, and extort them into a behavior that perhaps individually would repel them. And so I'm looking at the arrival of the daughter of Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, in New York in 1991, and she's delivering a packet full of money to someone in New York, courtesy of the ripoff by her late father, who I think had died around that period of time, who'd taken, I think, $400 million from the Mirror Group pension fund.
David, wait a minute now. There's something here called Yale School of Management that's encouraging people to connect with the Global Network for Advanced Management. And it does seem that Oxford is part of that network right here. The Said Business School at the University of Oxford is part of this network. And there seem to be a lot of connections between Yale and Oxford. There's something else about Oxford that I wanted to bring to your attention. It's always interesting, you've spoken to us about what is it? The evolution of symbols, I think you've said.
Yeah,
And I
The
was
Migration of Symbols, which is a book that I was trying to read as a teenager, but
right.
fascinating book.
Well, so in preparing the image for today, I was looking up. No, wait, this is different. I must have looked up the Oxford crest of arms. Is that possible? What's the difference between a coat of arms and a crest of arms? See, I looked up
Yeah.
the Oxford crest, and that gave me a Wikipedia entry. Here it is. Here's the coat of arms for the University of Oxford. And I used this in the image today. And it says the coat of arms depicts an open book with the inscription Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is my light. This was interesting to me, David, because, Hillary Clinton speaks about her affinity for Saul Alinsky, and he dedicated his book, Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer, the original radical, according to him. The name Lucifer means, I think, bringer of light. Barack Obama was also a huge fan of Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky and Lucifer made appearances at the Republican National Convention on Tuesday night. Let's see. Rules for Radicals on the dedication page acknowledges Lucifer, the original radical who gained his own kingdom. So, he's writing a book that he digs Lucifer. We've got this coat of arms saying the Lord is my light. It just seemed kind of connected to me. There are some other things in this Wikipedia entry talking about the three crowns. This book, let's see here. The arms have been in existence since around 1400, but have varied in appearance over the centuries. The number of seals and the text, for example, have both varied. The registered trademark was designed in 1993, David, the year that Bill Clinton was inaugurated as President of the United States. Same year the first attack on the World Trade Center occurred. What do you think of that?
Well, again, I think it's this connection. I believe now that we're in a place where we don't have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Bill Clinton is a double-cross agent run by Oxford University and the BBC. But we have a balance of probability argument that he is, because his behavior is totally consistent with the way in which the British staged, for example, Operation Mincemeat, to get the Germans to believe that the attack would be in Greece instead of Sicily. So the film that was made about Operation Mincemeat, right, was called The Man Who Never Was. And as I've said, I've always thought that Osama bin Laden could have been a man who never was, right? Because his background is really, really sketchy. Now, the propaganda office for Osama bin Laden was set up in London in 1994. And there is a record of payments being made through that office to various people associated with the attack of 9/11. Now, let's just go back to this company Circa that we're coming back to. If I'm the head of the Oxford Double Cross Group, let's say a modern incarnation of Masterman, and I'm looking at 9/11, and I want to create an attack that the Americans will think came from the outside of the country, when in fact it was aided and abetted, for example, by the Clintons. Now, what would I need to do? I'd need to create a fake or a virtual reality identity, such as Osama bin Laden. And I would need to organize a feint, which I would describe as an exercise. And if you Google the Global Guardian, Vigilant Guardian, September the 10th to the 12th, 2001, you'll see there was an exercise simulating an attack on the United States during the period when the attack went from simulation to real, right? And the face of Osama bin Laden is planted in that briefing document before the attack occurs. And what the BBC or the people who prepared that document, they're planting in the minds of Americans that an attack is likely from a guy who looks like Osama bin Laden. So they've set up in their minds, they've created, Jason, a script. The
There's a
script has
different
been
name
prepared.
for it, David. There was previously a different name for that thing, not Vigilant Guardian
No,
or
the
something else.
1st and 2nd of June 2001 exercise was Amalgam Virgo.
Ah, right.
And it's well worth putting that image up because Amalgam Virgo shows you the essential planning for the attack of 9/11, including that it was an attack orchestrated by this guy, Osama bin Laden. There we are, right in the center of it. That's 1st and 2nd of
released
June.
this document? Where does this document come from? I mean, we've seen it so many times.
Well, it would have come from deep within the Department of Defense, which I allege.
But couldn't it just easily be forged? Someone could have made this on their computer.
But again, we can spend a great deal of time trying to prove it was forged or not forged. It's never been disputed that these exercises are held twice a year. In the case of Amalgam Virgo, the exercise script was about a plane being hijacked over Alaska, flying south over Abbotsford, and then turning east, and the target was the Capitol building. Right? And there was a period, if you keep going, keep Googling, keep scrolling up, and I'll tell you when to stop. There's a very interesting period or timeline associated with the stand down of the United States Air Force. Keep going, keep going. There, stop there. Stop there. Now that I've looked at time and time again, and there's a number of anomalies. And remember Occam's razor?
Yes.
You have to come up with the simplest explanation to fit all the facts. It is not in dispute that there were 6 cans of Budweiser on that particular document. It is not in dispute that the timeline included some planes from Canada, CF-18s, right? A period of stand down when the F-18s or F-16s of the United States Air Force was stood down, and Canada was given control of the skies over America for 30 hours during this exercise. How dumb can you get? Why would the American Joint Chiefs of Staff decide that was a good idea to stand down the United States Air Force during an exercise that simulated an attack by a hijacked passenger jet on the Capitol building? Right? This is a classic example of a double cross. That is to say, the American military, the command and control systems, were tricked into thinking this was a perfectly safe maneuver because they can rely on Canada. Well, I'm telling you now, you can't rely on Canada. You can rely on Canadians generally, but you can't rely on the line of reasoning that stretches back to Pierre Trudeau and the London School of Economics and the visit to Castro and the visit to Mao Zedong in China, and what would appear to have been the systematic transfer of vaccine and viral technology by Canada to the communist Chinese, right? Remember, I believe this was a double agent, right? The woman who was escorted off the premises of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, a Chinese-born woman, and all her students were taken off the premises and returned, as best we can understand, to Wuhan City, where the outbreak occurred.
We still haven't heard what happened to that scientist.
Right. But I believe the people in the RCMP intelligence arm that arranged for that woman to take biological samples from the National Microbiology Lab included Cameron Ortis, the head of intelligence for the RCMP, under the directional auspices of Bob Paulson, the former commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who was in charge of the raid on Starnet.
David, here it is. This is the National Microbiology Lab of Winnipeg. It's a giant facility.
Absolutely. And they had samples, apparently, of the coronavirus and the Ebola virus inside that laboratory. In the case of the Ebola virus or the Ebola DNA, a researcher from that lab was arrested at the American-Canadian border and he had 22 files of DNA material from the Ebola virus in the boot or the trunk of his car. He got 17 days in jail. It's a farce.
It's a very high security place. They have this fence around it. And then what's this?
But it leaks. It leaks like a sieve.
Oh, that says Canada or something, right?
No. Right.
So it's a national government building.
Justin Trudeau, the son of Pierre Trudeau, has announced that he's providing support through, I think they call it the National Research Council, for the development of the COVID-19 vaccine in a joint venture with CanSino Biologics of Hong Kong.
Do they have an office in Winnipeg?
I don't think so, but I do believe they have a joint research facility and they share researchers and so on. So what was developed in the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg has been shared with CanSino Biologics that's been set up in Hong Kong by Sidley Austin. And now one of the favorites to getting a vaccine into circulation is the CanSino Biologics, which is in a joint venture with the Chinese People's Liberation Army Medical Services. So you're in danger in America of getting a vaccine developed with the Chinese military and effectively Justin Trudeau's cronies.
Who would take that? That's crazy.
But it's going to be the law, Jason. Quite soon, if we keep going with Bill Gates, I keep making that mistake, with Bill Gates funding these organizations, right? He is funding that educational show with Angelina Jolie for the BBC, which is teaching children how to recognize fake news, right? This is a typical, I believe, double agent procedure, because why don't we have a quick look at some of the tattoos on Angelina's body that I would like to discuss from a steganographic point of view, because these tattoos, I think they carry a very important message.
All right.
So what I want to see is the one with the crucifix on her lower navel and with the coordinates of her children's place of birth on her arm, and various other comments, if you will, like know your rights. That's on the back, just below her neck, right?
Look at this Hebrew writing she's got on the back there, arranged like this. I mean, what is this all about, David?
Well, the point is, you've made the point, and I agree with you. The steganography is hidden in plain view. These are messages that she doesn't hide, but it conveys a very important message. So the BBC, and let me just cut to the chase with respect to my friend Greg Dyke in the BBC. I believe his predecessor as Director General of the BBC, John Burt, who's an Oxford alumnus, he was the man who signed off on the application for that spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals in 1998. Greg Dyke, my buddy, comes in on 2000 and he's kicked out in 2004, but he's not an Oxford alumnus, right? In 2004, in comes Mark Thompson, who's a name that might be familiar with you, right?
Yeah, he's the CEO of the New York Times. He went to Oxford?
Absolutely, right? And so from 2004, whatever, when he supposedly, or at least one of his brief was investigate Jimmy Savile, right? He didn't. That investigation went nowhere. Now, Jimmy Savile was probably an expert pedophile entrapment specialist from the late 1960s, if not before, right through to the time of his death, working with the BBC. And I believe that Jimmy Savile was a fundamental component in the BBC's development of the double agent technique, where you entrap someone, right, into a sexual encounter with a child, and you blackmail them, and you threaten to reveal what they've done to a child unless they serve you as a double agent inside a target country like the United States of America or Canada. So I think they played Greg Dyke as a sucker because they knew without the background at Oxford, he would not understand that there was a double cross operation being prepared for the BBC through 911. And I think people like Bill Clinton knew exactly what was planned, right? And he needed an alibi. So on 911, he finds himself at the Port Douglas Millennium Sheraton Hotel in Australia. But remember, we talk about the Occam's razor that has to fit all the anomalies and the facts, right?
Yes.
The anomaly for 911 that I believe may very well put Bill Clinton behind bars is that on the bottom of the image showing whatever it was that hit the Pentagon, let's assume it's really immaterial what hit the Pentagon. What is material, along the bottom, it's got a date stamp and a time stamp, those images from outside the Pentagon. The date stamp is the 12th of September, 2001. And that's the date of Bill Clinton's stay in the Millennium Sheraton Hotel in Port Douglas in Queensland. The timestamp is very interesting because it shows 17:37:19. And that's the time in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, where Serco ran the control tower that would have been in a position to transmit over these international networks the telemetry signal that guided whatever it was that hit the Pentagon across the Pentagon lawn at 500 miles an hour at 15 feet elevation to punch a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon. Now, we come back to the basic principles of physics. Whatever the theory they would like us to believe, you cannot fly a large passenger jet at 500 miles an hour at 15 feet elevation, because ground air turbulence will rip it apart. So it wasn't a large passenger jet that flew across the Pentagon lawn. And it wasn't a large passenger jet that killed Captain Gerald DeConto, the duty officer of the Pentagon, and 125 of his colleagues. So no one survived as expert witnesses at what did hit the Pentagon. But I would remind Americans that in 1972, Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers bombed the Pentagon, or at least the women's washroom in the Pentagon, in 1972. So there's a thread of criminality. Forget terrorism. These people have created a system, and I believe it's the double cross system, inherited or exported by the British into the United States, so that these criminals or psychopaths can actually conceal the real agenda. And going back to the words of 1984, it is a non-ideological party that George Orwell would have called the inner party, and I believe David Rockefeller describes as a supranational government of international bankers and an intellectual elite. Over to you.
Yeah. It's just fascinating, David, how all this stuff ties together. You know, people who are sponsors on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth can go back and look at our visit to the BBC Broadcasting House, where we saw this giant statue of George Orwell. He's telling us that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. This is a strange contrast to their other statue, which instructs people to absculta, to listen and obey. I think it's also worth mentioning to people that this Orwell statue is sort of hidden within the structure of the BBC Broadcast House. You can't even really see it on Google Earth, as far as I'm aware. You and I are frequently looking at this BBC Broadcasting House right near the Langham Hotel. But it wasn't until we actually went there and put boots on the ground and spoke to some of the BBC employees that we actually got a good understanding for what's going on. As I recall, David, the Orwell statue is kind of right here under this tunnel. So let's see if we can get there on Google Earth. Oh, there is a path. Let's see if it takes us under there. Oh, look at that, David. There he is.
It's just up to the right, yeah.
There he is. So we can go there on Google Earth.
Yes.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yes. And again, going back to this double cross program, it's hard to know exactly when the penny dropped as far as intelligence is concerned, that a dead spy is less use than a spy who's been persuaded to act as a double agent because of the information you can get and feed to your enemy.
Yeah.
And I believe what George Orwell was describing with his Room 101 torture is the idea, and in the case of the heroes of 1984, it's Winston is one and his girlfriend is Julia.
Mm-hmm.
And so the phobia or paranoia of Winston is he's terrified of rats, right? So the torture that they threaten Winston with is to have a cage strapped to his face with a couple of hungry rats, and then you lift a gate or gates, right, pun intended,
Bill
with a
Gates.
cage, right? And the rats start eating his face. And he's told that if he authorizes the torturers to do what they're doing to him, to his girlfriend, Julia, they'll stop doing it to him. Now, that could be a mother-child, father-son relationship where you're torturing the loved one of an individual because that puts greater pressure on the individual than perhaps who might be able to withstand personally a great deal of pain before betraying his country. I believe that technique was refined within the BBC and the Oxford double-cross group during World War II. I believe that George Orwell wrote that book or published it, I think, in 1949, 1984. Not too critical when he did it. But I think that didn't come out of his imagination. He was describing a procedure by which the double-cross group was able to flip a spy by threatening to torture or reveal something about their relatives back in Germany and expose the relatives to being punished or incarcerated by the Nazis. So it's a very powerful technique. And that's the cornerstone, torture, of the double-cross technique developed at Oxford and picked up, I believe, by Bill Clinton and the acolytes in Chicago.
David, let's focus if we can for the next few minutes because we're close to the end of our show here. I want to talk about the power of this double agent idea, and if we think about the notion of Bill Clinton being turned to having an allegiance to some group, whether it's
criminal group
that wants to destroy the United States, he's aligned with that. But his status as a double agent is he appears to be the president of the United States, and everybody thinks he's a great guy. You should send your money to him if you want to give a charitable donation to Haiti or underprivileged countries in Africa. He's got the Laureate University that he was involved in. His cover is that he's a respectable ex-U.S. president. His actual status is he's a rapist, a serial psychopath, and he's working towards the destruction of the United States of America. So, as a double agent, he's very effective. Same thing with Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, because, they appear to be respectable, mature, former radicals who are now academics. But in fact, they remain dedicated to the destruction of the United States. We see how these individuals, these double agents, they utilize social engineering to fool people into thinking that they're great. And I believe, David, that there have been a number of double agents who have been sent to try to compromise what I'm doing here with Crowdsource the Truth. This same maniac who has presented himself as Tom Thumb and a variety of other stupid names, who just for such a long period of time has tried to convince me that what you're telling me is not true. It doesn't make sense, David. If someone watches our show and doesn't like it, I think the natural response would be to just turn it off. But for someone to spend 2 years, 3 years persistently trying to convince me of something about you in absence of facts, this guy goes back and forth between insulting me and trying to be my friend. What is that? Who acts like that? There have been a number of people who I've exposed. Kevin Shipp, George Webb. I think these are people who approached me as friends. Susan Holmes, Patricia Negron. I believe these people approached me as friends, but never had good intentions. Quinn Michaels. And at the right moment, they flip, and they then go out and say, ooh, I know all kinds of things about Crowdsource the Truth and Jason Goodman that I could tell people that will damage Jason. I can be involved in lawsuits, etc., in ways that will hurt Jason. In the case of this lawsuit, there are specific roles that these double agents carried out, operational plans within the lawsuit, who came to me with information about Robert David Steele that was presented as something that was intended to be helpful, but actually got rolled into the lawsuit that I got blamed for these people saying things that may or may not be true, things that they did to ensure that my involvement in the lawsuit would go the way the plaintiff wanted it to. These are all the same type of techniques you're talking about, David. Double agents, plants.
Yeah, so social engineering is operated by double agents and their handlers, right?
Correct.
Where you're employed to role play, right? And in a sense, it's nothing personal, like whether they like you or not, although you might feel they dislike you or whatever. They basically said, here's a way, distract, get Jason Goodman off track. So he's focused on the extraordinary amount of time and effort you spent defending yourself in an irrelevant court. When I think now, thanks for putting up that sort of the big picture there, we're looking at an empire that is non-ideological, right? They want us to talk about Marxist-Leninism or Chinese, etc. What you see in that chart, which actually the map dates back to the turn of the century, the 19th century, and the all red line, which was undersea cables that connected the colonies, right? But now we're looking at basically fiber optics. So if we look at the DNA of the technology that allows basically the world to move to a supranational government of international bankers and an intellectual elite, it's a world that runs on the rails of advanced fiber optics and wireless and data networking, which, as we know, for people who watched the last week's show, Nortel, which was the world leader in fiber optics and wireless and data networks, was infiltrated starting around the 1987 period by, I believe, the Oxford group of double agents that began to pick up the patents or move the patents together, aided and assisted by Bill Clinton, and transfer that to Huawei, the Chinese conglomerate. By the time of 9/11, Huawei would have been in a position, remember we talked about friend or foe switching? I believe that Huawei was in a position to switch out the Nortel networks in the Twin Towers over to Huawei networks, launch a man-in-the-middle attack on the United States of America, and then as soon as the two buildings come down, or they've got the building number 7 came down with all the relevance, to switch back to what looks like a Nortel control of the communication systems through 911. So now, going a little further forward, I believe that the BlackBerry had been compromised, the BlackBerry security systems, and they were starting working on a modified BlackBerry that would one day see the light of day as the Phantom Secure Network, developed in Richmond, British Columbia, to connect 20,000 criminals around the world to a supranational government of international bankers and an intellectual elite. And I want to just touch on the fraud on what I believe is happening as we speak on the teachers' pension fund. Because on 911, on the 47th floor of building number 1, WTC 1 in New York, you had a meeting of Serco shareholders that included Blackstone's private equity group and Blackstone Inc., the shadow banker, 10 global custodians, and the pension funds of TIAA, the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, which has $1 trillion of assets under management, and the University Superannuation Scheme, which has 65 or 75 billion of assets under management. Those two pension funds, the people inside those pension funds, I believe they're getting a little message. You know, if we can steal the pension fund of the Mirror Group, aided and abetted by the late Robert Maxwell and I believe his daughter Ghislaine Maxwell, we can always defraud or steal money from your pension funds. So I think that's an additional way, apart from torture and extortion, etc., of threatening the teachers involved in this conspiracy through the loss of their pension fund. Over to you.
David, I've just happened upon this article here from Wired magazine. This article is from just prior to the 2016 election, September 2016 at 6:16 p.m. It's saying that Clinton should have destroyed her phones better. And it's interesting because it takes this quote from a security expert, and they agree that one surefire way to be certain your data is truly removed and unrecoverable is to kill the hardware. They've excised this quote from Eric Brown, a lab manager at a forensic data recovery firm, that says, you destroy that certain piece that's storing the critical information, there's little chance you're going to get it back. But what strikes me about this quote, David, is I want to hear what piece he's talking about, because I happen to know that phones use non-volatile RAM. They don't use spinning hard disks. They use these chips to store the things that are stored in your phone. And usually there are several of these chips that together make up the total bank of storage in the phone. And if you destroy some of them, yeah, you can't recover data from the destroyed ones, but the parts that remain undestroyed, see, this to me, this guy could have very well been speaking about a certain piece that controls the encryption. And if you destroy that certain piece, it doesn't sound like he's talking about the total memory storage of the phone. He's talking about a certain piece. And this is what you and I have speculated about previously. That's interesting. I want to hear more about what this data recovery expert, forensic data recovery firm Flashback Data has to say about that. What do you think of that, David?
Well, that comes back to the difficulty of removing all traces of this conspiracy, which are residing on different components of a global network that I've called Phantom Scab, right? And remember, Bovis is one of the companies that was appointed by Nortel as an installer of its kit in July of 2001, together with AMEC. Now, Bovis upgraded the BBC's studios and communication system.
Right.
So when Nortel, I believe it was extorted into handing off installation of its kit, obviously it's a manufacturer, to AMEC and Bovis. What happened then, AMEC and Bovis installed networks ostensibly using Nortel kit, but in fact opening a back door to Huawei, which, as we know, is facing a RICO charge for the theft of intellectual property at a court in Brooklyn as we speak. So what happens with this is whatever she thinks or her aides think they destroyed by putting a hammer through her cell phones, I believe whatever she had access to and her husband, it resides somewhere in the cloud right now. You can't remove that trace. Now, anyone who gets close to removing that trace is at personal risk, obviously, either of being bankrupted, silenced permanently, or ridiculed, etc., etc. And I think what we've done, Jason, and I thank you for your key role in that, is help to communicate a really complex picture by identifying the principles, which would include the handlers of Bill Clinton from his period at Oxford, when I'm fairly certain he was entrapped and blackmailed and extorted into becoming a double agent for the Oxford group and the BBC. Now, I've often asked myself, is the Oxford group that planned and conceived of this double-cross program more or less powerful than the BBC? The reality is the power resides with the BBC because it has a weekly audience of 500 million people, right? It broadcasts in 50 languages, and it's launched, and this is a huge strategic mistake on their part, an educational show funded by Bill Gates and produced by Angelina Jolie to teach children how to recognize fake news. I can't imagine anyone less capable than Bill Gates and Angelina Jolie of teaching anyone how to recognize fake news when the BBC is generating fake news. So what they've got a double agent situation. They're probably well paid, off the books, right? And what they're doing is they're recognizing fake news as real news and dismissing it, and generating fake news in their own right. It's a double cross. Over to you.
It is. Now I want to take you down another rabbit hole here, David, because this might blow your mind. So at Oxford, Bill Clinton's roommate was this guy named Strobe Talbot. And they were very close. They actually remain close today. Strobe Talbot is now the president of the Brookings Institute. And apparently Christopher Steele, the MI6, whatever he is, who wrote this dossier that was used to dog President Trump, he updated Strobe Talbot on this thing. Strobe Talbot was very involved. This Brookings Institute is another one of these think tanks. James Comey has spoken at the Brookings Institute. This lawfare blog is very connected to the Brookings Institute. This lawfare blog published a lot of falsehoods related to the death of Peter W. Smith, a guy who created a fund to pay money to Arkansas state troopers who came forward to blow the whistle on Bill Clinton's criminality, who quickly lost their jobs. The Brookings Institute and various foundations that are linked to it have provided money to this lawfare company, whatever it is. They produce a blog, among other things. They have kind of a podcast, is what I'm getting at. Lawfare podcast. Shane Harris is an interesting individual who has absolutely lied to cover up facts and details about the strange death of Peter Smith. They've even produced recently this might not be the right one, but there's a lawfare podcast that I heard not that long ago where they're furthering lies about the death of Peter Smith. Very strange death, David. There's police evidence photographs that I have obtained which show 2 helium tanks in the room with Peter Smith. He's alleged to have committed suicide, but it seems much more like foul play because this individual, he didn't have a car and he was like 81. And we also obtained security footage from Walmart, which shows him purchasing 1 can of helium. I mean, this is a very strange way to commit suicide. I would think maybe a bottle of booze and sleeping pills might be what you would do. But there's this opened canister of helium. After doing our initial report of this, one of the Crowdsource the Truth viewers who contacted me had access to Walmart's inventory database and indicated that on the date this video was recorded, this Walmart in Rochester, Minnesota, only had 1 helium tank in stock. But police crime scene photos show 2 tanks of helium in the room. And there were a lot of questions surrounding the number of room keys, an individual who kicked in the door, the lack of investigation, how did he get there? I interviewed bus drivers who drive from this Aspen Suites hotel that he was found dead in to the Walmart in that area. It's very strange, David. Aspen Suites Hotel, it causes me to think about the Aspen Institute, which is another one of these think tank type things. I don't know if they're related to the Brookings Institute, but what the hell are all these think tank institutes? What exactly are they doing? And why is this death of Peter Smith of such interest to Shane Harris when I called him to alert him that he had misreported various facts about the death of Peter Smith. He didn't want more information to learn those facts. He just hung up the phone and told me that I was making spurious accusations, and then went on to make a podcast that reiterated his lies. I think Shane Harris is an apparatus of the intelligence operation.
Well, I think if we can give it a term, a double-cross operation set up by Oxford dons and faculty during World War II to turn agents that potentially could be from friendly powers, but looking down the road, people perhaps in the United Kingdom were thinking, well, maybe America won't be our friend all the time. Remember Lord Palmerston's remark, the British Prime Minister, great powers do not have perpetual enemies and eternal allies, right? So in the World War II, and the British have their back to the wall, there's a Lend-Lease program that's introduced. And there's, if you follow the Palmerston document or dictum or mantra, if you will, there's no reason for the British government or the senior people in the British government to assume that America will always be an ally. Remember, the colonies were, I suppose, strategically the friends of the British up to 1776, and then it became an enemy, at least during the duration of the War of Independence. So now, what would be prudent for the British, working on that same principle back in 1776, to maintain control over what had been a colony or group of colonies, the 13 colonies, and was now at least nominally an enemy? Well, why not set up two secret societies, Phi Beta Kappa and Kappa Beta Phi, both in 1776, where Phi Beta Kappa represents the intellectual elite, right? And today has 17 presidents, 30 Supreme Court judges, and 120 Nobel Prize winners, right? One of them, the Phi Beta Kappa members, is President Bill Clinton.
And
right?
David, what's really the difference between these Phi Beta Kappa type societies and the Aspen Institute or the Brookings Institute? They're all the same. They're basically clubs that you have to be some kind of fancy schmuck to get into, and we're not invited.
We're not invited, right? Now, the other flip side of that is the Kappa Beta Phi group, which I believe had a footprint similar to Phi Beta Kappa. But the only chapter left of Kappa Beta Phi is the Wall Street chapter, right? That was formed in 1929, which is the year of the big drop on the stock market, right? And the Kappa Beta Phi members include Wilbur Ross, who's the the Trump Commerce Secretary with responsibility for the patent office, which has been outsourced to Serco. You have Larry Fink, who's the chief executive officer of BlackRock Inc., the world's largest shadow banker, and Michael Bloomberg, what is he, the 9th richest man in the world, right, who controls the data feeds from the stock markets through his Bloomberg terminals, where if you're inside that, of course, you can trigger a catastrophe bond on a drop on the stock market of the kind that we've seen. So going back to 1770, well, the thing I like about that is the association between the technology of the time that allows these people, I believe, to conspire together in secret to execute synchronized attacks on an enemy that may have been not thought of as an eternal enemy or an eternal friend, and basically drive the world towards this supranational government of intellectual elites and international bankers. And the important thing to do that using the 1984 model, it's a non-ideological party. I do not believe that as far as these are concerned, there's any difference in the Chinese attitude or the British attitude or the American attitude to world government. They want to control you from the time and place of your birth, per the coordinates on Angelina Jolie's arm, which is the place of her children, to the time and place of your death, and the state owns your children, and you will wear a mask, you'll maintain 6 foot distance.
Right.
And when you're told what to do, what they expect you to say is, bah.
Right. Well,
You
we've
are a
now
sheep.
seen video, David, of the NYPD, not just Australian police in Sydney, but NYPD actually wrestling a young child away from a mother because she wasn't wearing the coronavirus mask. Now, here's Angelina Jolie's arm.
And you will find that the NICES, the New York employees, New York City employees retirement system, which manages the funds of the New York police, is heavily invested in Serco, right? And the catastrophe bonds that are triggered by Serco, for example, allegedly, by the bringing down of the two towers on 911 and killing, I think, 60 members of the NYPD and Port Authority police. So the ordinary blue-collar schmuck, right, is terrified of what these people can do. They can kill you at will, right? They can steal your pensions, right? They can take your senior officers and put them in a trap of the kind that I believe Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell put Bill Clinton in, and his wife, Hillary Clinton. And I think our number one job is to communicate to the people at large. There is light at the under the end of the tunnel, but you have to define it as elaborate, well-proven British double-cross operation against nominal friends or nominal allies, but it's nothing personal. The key is this isn't Marxist-Leninism, right? This is a global domination using terror, right, to secure the interests of the intellectual elite and the international bankers. Over to you.
Yeah. David, I think we're just about at the end of our show. Anything else that we wanted to cover today that we haven't? I mean, this is a very interesting topic, and it leads to so many other things. We're obviously going to continue to explore this, but I think this notion of turning the right type of individual and, you know, constantly attacking the office of the presidency of the United States, this makes sense from the standpoint of an organization that wants to overthrow the U.S. government, like the Weather Underground, like Saul Alinsky and international communists.
I would say that the Weather Underground is a proxy for that movement I described, you know, the movement towards a supranational government, right? And they're convenient because they're decoys. That is to say, we can spend a lot of time on Bernardine Dawn, but the important thing is to look at the trace that she leaves through society. So when she has a small seminar in 2005 at Northwestern University on torture paradigms and practice, I don't say that's steganographic, but it's a message that this woman is an agent for forces way above her, right, that is capable of inflicting the most heinous cruelty on a person or a person who's loved by someone else. So you can pressurize an individual by torturing the child, right? And I think that's a technique that is extraordinarily powerful because, you know, being any parent would be concerned about this.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I wanted to just bring up before we go is I saw the other day a video from 2016. Here it is. So this is Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn having kind of like an evening. They're asking the people demand the impossible. And this was an interesting video. It's fairly contemporary, recorded in November of 2016. And they're talking about, you know, how they're against the government and how Dick Cheney is their enemy. But I believe that this video is a bit of social engineering on their part. I believe they are double agents because they are now fully embedded in the government. They, I believe, were pivotal in helping Barack Obama become the president. They're obviously friends with Barack Obama, and they are basically socially engineering the people in their audience and anybody who sees that video into thinking that one thing is true when in fact another is, and their statements are false. I think that their goal has,
Can I just make a quick point? So
Please.
Of the top 240 members of the Obama administration, there are 12 with advanced degrees from Oxford. Apparently, that's more than any other, whether it's Yale or Harvard. So I would suggest to Americans that Michelle and Barack Obama are totally controlled through this double-cross network out of Oxford and the BBC, right? And what I'm writing on a regular basis, it's an open letter, I'm saying to the BBC, Sir David Clementi, who's the chairman of the board of governors, who is an Oxford man, incidentally, I want them to shut down that educational show produced or executive produced by Angelina Jolie and funded by Bill Gates, because I think that's a travesty. Those two are not capable of teaching children. They should not be allowed anywhere near.
But it's a continuation of the Weather Underground plan, David.
Correct.
Guard your schools is what they've always told us. So this is them basically bringing their plan to fruition. They've got, what's his name, Bobby Rush in there, and he's putting forward his, I've been told in this chat that HR 6666 has passed the House. Let's take a look at that. Congress, false claim.
While you're looking for that, if I just make out a writer, I believe that the BBC should pay very careful attention to what you and I are doing, because if they are associated with a double cross operation that stretches back to World War II, and those operations have gone rogue, so whilst it might have been legitimate to mislead the Germans into thinking there was an invasion into Greece as opposed to Sicily, so that you get a diversion of resources, it is not legitimate to use the same techniques in the attack on the United States of 9/11, where the systems were swapped around and people, that American citizens and the families of the dead firefighters would have believed these are friends, including, quite possibly, the former president of the United States, Bill Clinton, who I think...
Do you think what?
Who I think is a double agent, right? Together with his wife, and if we can start looking analytically, nothing personal about whether I like Bill Clinton or whether I like Donald Trump for that matter, but if you look at the characteristics of a double agent, they always slip up. And incidentally, John Masterman wrote a couple of detective stories and exposing or using the techniques. And I think I want to read those two stories, because I think you will find that John Masterman and people like that were very good at constructing a crime scene and positioning the clues so that the people trying to analyze what's really going on go in the wrong direction. In that case, back then in World War II, it was the Germans who sent the divisions to Greece to guard against the thing. But maybe on 9/11, there were people in the United States chain of command who actually put their resources in the wrong place, right? Where these double agents were then able to switch from an ostensible friend to a real foe, kill a whole bunch of people, terrify the hell out of the United States, withdraw back into this privileged status of a former president of the United States, if I dare say it, is, well, no, I won't say what I think he is. Anyway, over to you.
Well, but David, we've got David Kelly in the comments telling us that Bobby Rush is an FBI informant, just like Jesse Jackson. I didn't know that, but I would believe it, and that's puts him squarely in the position that you're talking about, of being able to sort of oscillate back and forth between this friend or foe position. I don't think FBI informants are necessarily our friends. They're guys who are, doing bad stuff for the FBI, but he could just as easily double cross the FBI. So here's govtrack.com is telling us that this bill would provide $100 billion in grants to faith-based organizations, clinics, medical centers, and other organizations which perform testing for COVID-19. And here's the sponsor's statement from Bobby Rush: bipartisan legislation to fund $100 billion coronavirus test. This was proposed on May 1st. But I do not think that Bobby Rush is a friend of the American people. David, we're going to have to continue exploring this next week. We've done our whole entire show on YouTube today for the benefit of the broader audience, but I want to remind people that if they've been interested in what we're talking about today, there is so much more of this available online when people go to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David and I could not keep bringing you this information without your support. There's obviously a lot of controversial subjects here that corporate sponsors do not get behind. So this system of individual viewer sponsors is absolutely critical to the future of this type of information and us being able to bring it to you. So I hope that people who are watching today for the first time or who are not yet sponsors will join us on Patreon and Subscribestar. If you want to learn more about David and his work, you can go to David's free website, reversecciscripts.com, and you can read all of David's posts there. David, we'll be back next week. Thanks for another really excellent show. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Jason. I'm glad to have been with you.
And thanks everybody for watching.